college, I took a course entitled Old Testament Theology. I pretty soon had my professor dialed in. After the first test, I knew what sort of multiple choice, fill in the blanks, and short answer he would ask. For the first paper, I used a bunch of his favorite words. I found out that was the way to appeal to him. I learned how to use the word cogent in a sentence. That was one of his favorite words. I trotted into the final exam quite confident. Ian, you need to advance me. Thank you. All right. The questions lay as I expected, multiple choice, fill in the answer, short answer with his favorite words. Then I hit the last page and, oh, here was a question I hadn't expected. Define sin in the Old Testament. Pretty broad question. Abraham likely felt the same times 10 when God laid his test on him. When he woke up that morning and God spoke to him and said, I want you to sacrifice your son Isaac. It must have felt, at least for a moment, like a full stop. What was God doing? God and Abraham had been cruising on joyful autopilot for years now. Some rabbis believe that Isaac may have been as old as 37 when this sacrifice took place. Isaac was at least a teen because Abraham felt free to lay the wood on his back. The promised son had been born and was growing into manhood. Abraham had life figured out. And it was at that point that God decided that he was ready for a large test. Well, and you're going to have to advance me, Ian. My remote's not behaving today. So, all right, go to the next one. The first question that jumps out to me is, why would God give anyone, let alone Abraham, such a test? Later in the Old Testament, he's going to make plain he doesn't want to have anything to do with child sacrifice. Why would he do this? A healthy marriage is only possible if both partners know that that other person can be trusted and they have a full commitment. When our concentration strays too far from our spouse to a hobby, to our children, to another person, and our attention level and commitment level starts to go down, the marriage becomes unhealthy. A relationship like that takes a full and total commitment. When we give our spouse that attention and care, the marriage strengthens, and that strengthening builds up the rest of our lives. Tests are given so teachers can determine what students have learned from the class. Abraham had been living in a close relationship with God for decades. Now it was time to see what he had learned from that close relationship. Next slide, please. One more, please. The first question that arises is, am I still first in your life, Abraham? Kids are amazing. It's wonderful to see them grow up to be part of their lives. Huge commitment to be a parent. It's very easy to get pulled in and maybe put too much attention on our kids and not enough attention on God. I mean, Isaac was the promised son. He was the miracle boy that God had given in Abraham's old age. He was the one that the promises were going to be fulfilled. Certainly, paying attention to Isaac was like paying attention to God himself, wasn't it? No, it wasn't. And God said to Abraham, am I still first in your life? Even ahead of your only son, Isaac. Jesus repeated the same question when he told his disciples that he was to be loved even more than parents and brothers and sisters. So I ask you, is God first in your life? Let me sharpen that a little bit. When it comes to time with God or time with your family, can God count on quality time from you with Him? Even ahead of your own family, if it's necessary. Does God have priority time in your life? Next click, please. The second question here for Abraham is, how far will you trust me? How far will you really trust me, Abraham? If I ask you for an ultimate sacrifice, will you make it? Abraham had left behind his homeland, you remember, at age 75, and God had given him a fantastic new land. Abraham had waited through decades of barrenness, and then Isaac was given to him. Will you trust me the next step, Abraham? How far will you dare to go with me? Well, when I was a kid, I loved climbing maple trees. Their branches just seemed to be the right distance apart. And I wasn't one of those squirrel climbers. You see some of these guys, they just right up a tree. I didn't do that. I went up and I, grab a branch and test it a little bit, and grab another branch and test it a little bit, and make sure I trusted it. But once I got that path worked out to go from the bottom to the top, then I would hustle right up because I knew every branch would hold me, and I could sit in the top and sway in the breeze. And we were up out of the valley just far enough. If you sat up there, you could look over the whole valley. It was really neat, sitting at the top of the tree. God was daring Abraham to the top of the mountain. Will you trust me? I can hold you. Will you trust me to the top of the mountain? What will the reward be if Abraham goes? He had to go and find out. And dare to give up his only son, Isaac. Where might God be daring you to trust? Abraham had to risk his most prized relationship to find out, what is God daring you to risk this morning? Next slide. The second question that comes to mind is, why would Abraham agree to such a test? He doesn't argue. He doesn't say, are you sure? He doesn't take Pepto-Bismol to see if it was something he ate last night. He just goes for it. Why would Abraham agree to take such a test? Well, past experience is part of it. Abraham had already walked sacrificially with God. As I mentioned earlier, he left behind his country and got a new homeland. He had dared to challenge 5 fighter kings. Remember, we talked about that a few weeks ago, in order to rescue Lot. And he was given victory. He let his nephew Lot choose a home first, and he was spared the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham had already learned that trusting God brought miraculous results from God's loving heart. He could dare to take this test because of past experience. But that's just the point, Pastor Ed. How could Abraham trust that this horrendous command could be from a loving God? How can a loving God command something that seems so unloving? Why would God give a son and then take him away? There's some debate about this, different commentaries that I read, and I have to say I agree with the ones that say this. And that is that Abraham fully believed that if he killed his son Isaac, that God would give him back from the dead. You have to remember, Isaac was the one. You know the old Isaac Ishmael story that we looked at a few weeks ago? It was not Ishmael. It was going to be Isaac. He was the child promised. God promised that everything that he had promised to Abraham would go through Isaac. And I think Abraham was so convinced of that he really thought that they would both come back to those servants of the donkey. Because God, if he needed to, would raise Isaac from the dead. There was no other option. God had made it very clear. It was Isaac or nobody. And God kept his promises. Let's see what the next slide is. Ian, I think I forgot to tell you to click a couple times. Give me another one. All right, let's go to the next one. What do the results of the test mean? One of the most popular courses at UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, was New Testament Survey. And it wasn't because everybody was so spiritual out of UC Berkeley, but the professor didn't require any homework. He only gave one test, final exam, and every year the question on that test was always the same. Discuss the wanderings and missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul. Well, one semester, a UC football player nicknamed Meathead found himself in the course. Meathead knew that he wasn't smart, so he asked the girl next to him, named Linda, to help him study for the final. The two of them memorized Paul's missionary journeys and studied them all semester. They had their essays down cold. On the day of the final exam, the two sat in the back of the auditorium, and the professor was passing out the tests and, you know, those little blue books that you write your answer in. And Linda thought, this is strange. Why do you even bother passing out tests? Everybody knows what the question is. Well, she found out when she got her test and her booklet, the question had changed. People in the front were moaning and groaning. The question was now, criticize Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Linda panicked. She didn't know anything about the Sermon on the Mount. She just folded face down on the desk. When she looked up, many of the students in the front were just throwing their papers on the teacher's desk and walking out in disgust. They had nothing to write. In 10 minutes, the room was empty, except for Meathead and Linda. Linda turned to Meathead, ready to leave, but he was writing furiously. He'd finished one page in his blue book and was starting to cover another. Linda watched. She was amazed. Wow, where's this coming from? Well, Linda turned in her few sentences and left Meathead hard at work. She came back about halfway through the test. She had 3 hours to complete the exam. She came back about halfway, figured Meathead ought to be done by then. Well, there was sweat on his brow, and he was writing like crazy, and he's still going at it. She couldn't believe it. So she thought, well, I'm going to go do something else. She came back at the very end of the test. He was still there. He was looking awful tired. Still writing. Finally, the teacher said, okay, hand in your test. And he had trouble getting out of his seat. He was so exhausted. Brought the test up, threw it on the desk, and just sat down, totally wiped out. He couldn't even tell Linda what he'd written on the exam. Well, they sat there and they waited for the professor to finish grading the tests. And they went up, and on the professor's desk, there were two piles. There was a pile of blue books, and all of them had a big red F on the front. And in the other pile was Meathead's book with an A+. An A+! How did he do this? Linda had to know. She grabbed the book, she picked it up, opened it, and she began to read. It said, who am I to criticize Jesus' Sermon on the Mount? I would instead like to write about Paul's wanderings and missionary journeys. Abraham's answer to God's test was just like Meathead's. He showed exactly what he had learned in the class from how he answered God. Early the next morning, he got up, didn't wait around, didn't argue. Abraham did all the work. He cut all the wood, he loaded the donkeys up, he got everything ready to go. He was going to do it if God said it, even if it didn't make sense. Even if it meant loss. Abraham had learned that God must be first in his life. He learned that. In Philippians 2, verses 9 through 11. Give me that slide, would you, Ian? One more. Therefore God exalted him, and this is Jesus, to the highest place, and gave him the name that is above every other name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven, on earth, and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. There will be a day when God will assert, I have to be number one in your life, because I'm above everybody else. When Abraham kneels at that day, it'll be natural for him, because he's learned that God's number one in his life. And there's many in our congregation that I think have learned that lesson too, or in the process of doing it. How about you? Will it be natural for you to kneel before Jesus in that day and acknowledge him as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords and the Lord of your life? That's what God was testing for with Abraham. Also, next slide, Ian. Abraham had grown in his trust in God. He'd grown over the years. When God first asked him to follow him, Abraham couldn't have made this kind of sacrifice. You remember, he had problems. He went down into Egypt, and he was so afraid that the guys would look at his wife, that he would get in trouble. And he said, Sarah, just say that we're brother and sister. Well, he'd gotten past all that now. He'd learned the hard way that you have to trust God. And that you could trust God. He'd grown in his trust with God. Satan and our bent desires tempt us to see us fail. God tests us at just the right time so that we'll have every reason to pass his tests. God gave Abraham this test at this time because he knew Abraham could pass it. Next slide, please, Ian. Keep it going. One more time. Abraham gave us a gift. His trust in God did. God loaded his language when he ordered Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. He said, sacrifice your only son whom you love. If you look in the New Testament and you search that phrase, only son, it's used for Jesus every place in the New Testament, except one, which refers back to this story. Abraham's gift was taking that only son, which we can imply represented Jesus, up on a specific mountain. And on that specific mountain, being willing to sacrifice his only son. Well, when Abraham pulled back that knife, he was doing it in the same spot that a Roman soldier pulled back a hammer and put a nail into God's only son's hand. We have a picture here of what God was willing to do for us because Abraham was faithful and carried out that picture exactly. God was willing to sacrifice his only son so that we can have forgiveness and new life. A little bit further, the mountain there is called the Lord Provides. And the reason that the mountain is called the Lord Provides is because there was a ram stuck in the bushes. Abraham didn't have to literally sacrifice Isaac because God provided a substitute in that ram to take Isaac's place. God provides a substitute for you and I to take our place in the face of God's judgment. Jesus. Isn't that fantastic? That Abraham's faith carried out was able to give us this full picture of salvation way back in the first book of the Bible. Amazing. He's called the father of the faithful. I'm glad he's my dad in that respect. And I still have a lot to learn. I couldn't take my kid up on the mountain. But he hasn't asked me yet either. Let's turn to number 98.